Show them the book.
Here's the book indeed.
The book really exists.
A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars by Brother Guy Consolmagno.
And there's a goodie bag downstairs, and all but one of them has a copy of that book. If you're unlucky, you get the bag that he swiped that book from.
Indeed. Wonderful book. I have gotten a chance to read through a lot of it. Fascinated by a lot of things. It's got a lot of something for everybody in there. A lot of history, a lot of science, a lot of spirituality. Your own personal story comes up a lot in there, and it just brings so many things together from so many angles. Curious to know, like, how did this project come about? Why did you write this book?
Well, somebody mentioned earlier I had a book called Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? Which the subtitle was going to be in all the other stupid questions people keep asking us. But the publisher thought that maybe that wasn't a good subtitle. The book was actually worked really well. I did that with a fellow named Paul Muller, who's a philosopher of science. And the editor was a guy named Larson. And he now works at Loyola Press. Not Larson. Oh. I'm always terrible at names. Anyway, the editor, it's Gary, and I always want to say Gary Larson because of the cartoonist. It's Gary something else. I'm very embarrassed. That's what he gets for not being here tonight. He wrote to me and he said, at Loyola Press, we've got a great title for a book, A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars. Could you write it? I started out life as a journalist. And I discovered very quickly I'm a terrible journalist because there was whenever there was a racket out the window, I'd close the window rather than find out what the story was. And I was terrified to call up total strangers and ask them embarrassing questions. But I learned how to write fast. Not necessarily good, you can make it good later. So he said, yeah, and we need the text by, 6 months. And I said, sure, no problem. And after I agreed to it, I said, what am I going to write? So I kind of threw everything, including the kitchen sink, into it. All the stories, I've told a few of them before, a lot of them I've never told, a lot that I've always wanted to tell but never had the right venue. One of the great things, anybody here who's been following astronomy for years is probably familiar with Comet Shoemaker-Levy. That's the comet that hit Jupiter in 1994, made a big splash, so to speak.
About 15 of them.
Yeah. The Levy of Comet Shoemaker-Levy is a fellow named David Levy, and he's an astronomer who discovers comets. You get comets named for you if you discover it. Except that his doctorate is not in astronomy. It's in English literature. And in fact, his master's degree was also in English literature, and he wrote his master's thesis on the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins that had to do with comets. Yeah. You never knew that there was that connection. Yeah. But he's gone through not only the poetry, but also the letters and the writings of Hopkins, and he says Hopkins knew his astronomy. Wordsworth says, oh, wow, look at the stars, aren't they cool? Hopkins talks about real comets that you can identify from the details he gives you. And to me, that's a very Jesuit thing, that you look at the sky because it's beautiful, but then you also want to know, what is that I'm looking at? And then you also want to know, how can I celebrate that to feed both the heart and the brain? Because this is who we are, human beings created by God as part of God's creation to celebrate creation in all the different ways we could do it. So I was able to interview him as a chapter for the book and found out all sorts of great things about him and about Hopkins and about poetry. And if you ask me 3 times, I'll recite some of my favorite Hopkins poetry from memory, so don't.
Well, that's a great example of the way that you kind of bring things together, things that people in the maybe popular culture ordinarily wouldn't think would go together. And another great example of this that really stood out to me was in one chapter you connected, that's a little teaser for you guys, you connected the study of Martian meteorites to the resurrection. And it was an amazing thing. So I want to maybe just talk about sort of the spiritual value of connecting things like that together.
It's using your brain.
Yeah.
The worst thing that anybody ever said about science was the non-overlapping magisteria of, again, the famous writer whose name I'm deliberately forgetting, who wrote a book, Rock of Ages. He was a great, popularizer of geology, not himself a believer and trying to say the right things about faith and science, but just didn't get it. And he says, well, there's religion, and you do that part of the year, and then there's science, and you do that on, the rest of the week. And they just, as long as they don't overlap, they'll never get. They always overlap. Human beings choose to do science for religious reasons. Human beings engage in God because every religious experience is an experience. It's something that happened. It's data. It's not just, I think I'll believe because it will make my mom happy. That kind of belief doesn't work. It doesn't last. And yet, in order to do science, to be logical, you also have to have things that you accept on faith without being able to prove them. And I can give you three axioms. Every, whether it's Euclid or the laws of science, every logical system has to start with assumptions. It's Gödel's law. Gödel, I remember. Axiom number one, that the physical universe actually exists. That we're not just, butterflies dreaming that we're philosophers or philosophers dreaming that we're butterflies. It's not all that, all is illusion. I can't prove that. But if I didn't believe it, I wouldn't waste my time being a scientist. You have to believe, if you're going to be looking for the laws of nature, that there are laws of nature to be found. Who was the first person to think that? If you thought the universe is controlled by nature gods, so the lightning bolt crashed because the nature god threw the lightning bolt, then you're not going to need science. You've got the answer to everything. But that's not satisfying. And if instead you believe in a religion that says there's only one God, not nature gods, and in the beginning God's already there before there's a universe, so that is a supernatural God, what Rabbi Sachs called the understanding of God outside of nature, beyond nature. That's what supernatural means. Casper the Friendly Ghost, that's not supernatural. If he existed, we could eventually do science on him. But God is outside of nature, who deliberately creates. Because the third thing you have to believe is that the universe is worth studying, not because it's going to get you a better Teflon, not because it's going to get you cooler cell phones, but just because knowing the universe itself makes you more than just a well-fed cow. One of the stories I tell, I'm getting wound up, but stay with me here. I was 30 years old. I was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. I'd been 5 years a postdoc. Anybody in the academic world knows 5 years as a postdoc means I couldn't get a job. I'm lying in bed wondering, why am I worried about the moons of Jupiter when people are starving in the world? And I didn't have an answer. So I quit. I quit MIT. I joined the Peace Corps. Send me someplace where people need me. I can teach English, literature, poetry someplace. They sent me to the University of Nairobi to teach astrophysics to grad students, which I could have done that in Boston. But all my Peace Corps friends were up country. I'd visit them every weekend with a little telescope that I brought with me, and a handful of slides. Remember slides? And a projector that they ran off of car batteries. And I'd talk about the things that NASA was discovering. And people in the most remote villages of Kenya wanted to look through my telescope and go, wow, at the craters on the moon. Go, wow. Has anybody here ever seen the rings of Saturn in a small telescope? Have any of you ever seen the rings of Saturn and not gone, oh, wow? And everybody in Kenya went, oh, wow, because that's what human beings do. And my very clever cat never wanted to look through the telescope. But human beings, this is what makes us human. To ask these questions of who are we and what is that? And oh, by the way, can I go, oh, wow? It is literally true that we do not live by bread alone. I'd read that someplace. But that means that you have to believe the physical universe is a route to God. That the physical universe is not some sort of, denizen of sin that's going to make you horrible. Chocolate was invented to give you acne and make you fat, and you should meditate to a higher level. No! Chocolate is a foretaste of the goodness of heaven and should be treated as such. Those are how, as a Jesuit, I can incorporate my love of chocolate, my love of the sky, my love of talking to people. All of it is tied up and unified by my love of the Creator.
Mm-hmm. Amen, indeed, yeah. Speaking of the oh wow factor, I want to bring up the title of the book, A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars. And one of the ideas that comes up in the book a couple of times is that finding God in nature and finding God in the universe and in the stars involves that oh wow factor, just the feeling of feeling so small and under the sky. But it also involves more than that as well. You mentioned that in the book a few times. Can you talk about what's unique about A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars?
Well, there's three things I finally decided that make astronomy, particularly Jesuit astronomy, why there is a Jesuit guide. You could find a lot of our spirituality in St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises. And all of them, the principle and foundation is all about God created things to bring us to God. It's all about things, and we are created things. G.K. Chesterton has this wonderful line where he says, to the ancients who want to worship nature, God was our mother, but to St. Francis, God is our sister. Nature, no, I'm sorry, not God is our mother. Nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. Thank heavens there are no observers from the Vatican here. If nature is our sister, that means that nature and we share a common father. And that's how we treat nature, not as something to dominate or something to be afraid of, but something to love. And so that sense of why do I do the astronomy at the end of the day? It's not to make me famous. It's not to make me rich. It wasn't to get girls, didn't work for me. Why do you do it? Because, it sounds glamorous looking at the stars, but the actual day-to-day work can be tedious at times. As you're going over your computer models and it still doesn't work and it still doesn't work, and you begin wondering, am I even approaching this in the right direction? Will one more day finally bring me the breakthrough, or am I totally going in the wrong way? What makes me want to do it? It's that sense of fun underneath that keeps me looking for that one piece in the jigsaw puzzle that kind of has that funny little lump in the side and a little bit of blue, because I know it's got to be there. Because it gives me joy. And that sense of joy is the presence of God. I described once playing cards when I was a little kid. It was a rainy day. I'm 10 years old. My mom pulls out the cards. We're playing. And why is my mom playing cards with me? She's a grown-up. I'm a kid. She could win anytime she wants to, right? She's doing it because she loves me. Because this is how she can spend time with me. Astronomy is God showing me he loves me by giving me a thing to do with him. But the second part of the Jesuit nature of astronomy is that it engages not just the, oh, wow, it's just fun, but it engages the mind and it engages the heart. I've got a lot of pretty pictures in there. I think more than 70 photographs. And
amazing photographs, yeah.
A lot of them, beautiful sunsets. You go, oh, wow. The physics behind why sunsets look like that is just as equally, oh, wow. Mm-hmm. And the history of James Clerk Maxwell and how he came up with those laws and the story of who he was and who he worked with and the people he worked among, that's also a wonderful story. And the poetry, the art, the history, the science, these are all the things you find at Jesuit universities, and I guess other universities too. We'll grant the Franciscans one or two. That sense of engaging the whole person. The third thing, and this is something that I think is marvelous to the Jesuits and other orders. Once you found out, you got to share it. If you don't tell anybody about it, it didn't happen. You've got to write it down. You've got to write it up. You've got to publish it. You've got to give public talks or write books or give lectures to whatever audience you're speaking to. Because it is in the community of people that we learn not only how much fun this is. I do the work so I can share it with my friends at the next meeting I go to. But I'm also waiting for the moment when they tell me, yeah, but you forgot. Or the worst thing I ever heard after I gave a talk about comets and somebody said, if what you said was true, comet tails would point in the other direction. I go, you're right. I think I lost a order of magnitude someplace. But that's how you learn. You learn by being wrong. You learn by admitting you were wrong. The most important sacrament that people forget is the act of contrition, the sacrament of reconciliation, because we need to be reconciled, because we need to admit that we're wrong. And if we can admit that I'm wrong and I still love me, I can even put up with you when you're wrong. So it's those three things, I think, make science Jesuit science.
Yeah. More than a book of facts, it's like a conversation.
It's this conversation with each other and with the people in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
As Chesterton said, tradition is the conversation, the democracy of the dead.
Indeed.
You let the people from the past have their say as well.
Well, speaking of people from the past, the book has stories of lots of Jesuit astronomers in here. So Guy is in a line of many illustrious astronomers that were in the Society of Jesus. And just curious to know if you wanted to talk about maybe your favorite one and why.
I'm going to talk about. The greatest astronomer you've never heard of.
Yeah.
It says so in Sky and Telescope this month, because somebody quoted me saying that. How many people in this room are old enough to remember the Don Camillo books or the movies? They came out after, in the 1950s. They're set in post-World War II. I read them in translation as a kid, and that was sort of like, oh, Italians are like that? I want to go there. These are my people. They were set, if you know the stories, they were set in Reggio Emilia, in the area around there. Out of Reggio Emilia, 200 years ago, was born a middle-class fellow named Angelo Secchi. If you look him up on the internet, sometimes they'll say Piero. His name was not Piero. The P stands for Padre. He was educated in physics, brought to Rome in 1848 when Garibaldi marches in and everybody has to flee and the Jesuits are kicked out. So he's sent up to this obscure school in the middle of nowhere, northern England, Stonyhurst. Old boy Stonyhurstian back there. He spends a term there learning astronomy because they've got a wonderful telescope. And then he's shipped off to the even more obscure place called Georgetown, where he spent a couple of years learning astronomy and learning meteorology. And then the politics changes and he can go home. At age 29, he's made the director of the Roman College Observatory. And the first thing he has to do is to figure out where to put a telescope. Oh, we've got this wonderful tower. You can see the sky from everywhere. And the tower shakes in the wind. And you don't want to have a telescope that shakes in the wind. But right next to it is a church. If you've ever been to Rome, you've been to the Church of St. Ignatius. You walk inside, and the dome looks kind of dirty, and why don't they light it better? And as you walk in, you go, that's no dome. It's a flat roof, painted to look like a dome, because they ran out of money. So there's a flat roof with 4 pillars and nothing on the pillars. So he put his telescopes on the pillars. And the first thing he did was to observe with a really good telescope Mars. But since he was not a classically trained astronomer, and astronomers in those days measured the positions of the planets very carefully, measured the positions of the stars to work out the times in your location, he's not interested in positions. He says, did you know that Mars has bright regions and dark regions and icy caps? And the dark regions seem to go through 2 bright regions like channels. He uses the Italian word canali, but what he is seeing is real. not the canali that Percival Lowell saw a generation or two later. He's the first person to study planets for what they are, and to ask not where are they, but what are they. And then he puts a prism in front of his telescope lens, and every point of star becomes a little rainbow. And he says, you know, there are little gaps in the colors, and that tells you, I've just learned from Fraunhofer, what chemicals are present in the stars. And out of 5,000 stars, most of them fit into 4 or 5 categories. And suddenly I'm classifying stars by their chemistry, and out of that I can even work out their temperature, and out of that I can see an evolution of one kind of star into another. He has invented astrophysics because he's asking the question no one had ever asked before. Not where are the stars, so I can tell time or navigate, but what are the stars? Not because it's going to make me rich, but just because, this is what the universe is made of. And it's made out of the same stuff there as down here. Isn't that interesting? Why have you never heard of him? Because the English astronomers were about 5 years behind him, jealous of what he did, and made sure that his work was never translated into English. But he's being rediscovered. And there is a woman who works with the Vatican Observatory, Ileana Canici, who wrote a biography of Angelo Secchi for his 200th birthday, which won the AAS award for Best History of Astronomy Book of the Year. So this is a comer. This is somebody who you're going to be hearing more and more of. And I could go on for another hour, but I won't.
He's got a couple of things named after him, doesn't he?
You want to know how clear water is? You take a white disk, you lower it into the water, into the lake, or into the ocean until you can't see it anymore. The clearer the water, the deeper you can lower it. It's called a Secchi disk, because he invented it one afternoon while he was on the steam corvette of the Vatican city-state with the Vatican admiral, and they needed to map out the clarity of the water. He also looked at solar flares and the sun's magnetic field and compared that to the magnetic field on Earth, and saw the connection between solar flares and our magnetic field. NASA is now got a spacecraft to measure that, because if there's a solar flare, it can affect our communications, it can affect the power transmission of lines. Those solar flares create a spike in the magnetic field here on Earth. The satellite has an instrument called the Sun-Earth Connection Coronal and Heliospheric Investigation Package. Sun-Earth Connection Coronal Heliospheric. They're never going to make an acronym out of Consolmagno, but they made a NASA acronym out of him because he was the one who invented the idea.
Yeah. What I love about that is it's almost like a whole new take on how the Pope emphasizes the importance of encounter, and we think about that mostly in terms of encountering other people, but like the universe is also a point of encounter.
It's a point where we encounter God, and it's a point where friends can encounter the universe together and say, hey, did you see that? You've been to a zillion national parks. That was your job. But it's so much more fun when you go with somebody.
Yes.
When you share it with somebody.
Indeed.
And science only works when there's a community. Golly, maybe that works with religion too. That, trying to find God on your own in your basement, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, is kind of like saying, well, I think I'll invent calculus on my own. It's been known to happen, but not very often.
Indeed. Amazing wisdom. Let me ask you this, actually. How is being part of an organization like the Vatican Observatory, how does that enhance the work you do in terms of writing?
I only joined the Jesuits when I was 40, similar to you. And I had been a professor at a place called Lafayette College before then, and at Nairobi and Harvard and MIT and those places. And I lived off NASA grants. In those days, I did the science that NASA said they would pay for. And I did the kind of science that would have an answer that I could show off after 3 years, because otherwise I wouldn't get my grant renewed. When I arrived at the Vatican Observatory, The director then, George Coyne, wonderful man, looked me in the eye and said what I now say to new people, your job, do good science. Doesn't matter how long it takes, doesn't matter, within reason we'll support it. Financially, we're not going to buy you a particle accelerator, but frankly, if you're a Jesuit, you'll find a friend who has one. It opens all of these doors. And I know it's being a Jesuit because those doors weren't open before I entered the Vatican Observatory. But it allows us to do the kind of high-risk, high-payoff work like thinking about quantum gravity like Gabriele does. So, if you never get an answer, we're not going to fire you. It allows us to do long-term survey work of the physical properties of meteorites, taking data that we didn't know when we started taking the data are going to explain the things that NASA discovered at asteroid Bennu. Our data explained that. We didn't know that when we took that data. It allows Chris Corbally to spend years doing surveys of stellar spectra. So we can do the kind of science that our colleagues depend on, because we can do it and they can't. But they also gives us the freedom to write. I started out as a journalist. I love writing. I love having things to write about. And, I'll write another book at the drop of a hat if anybody challenges me. But it gives me a community of people who will understand when I'm disappearing, it's because I'm writing, but who also understand that, yeah, you're a really good writer. Guess what? So is everybody else in the house. Yeah, you're a really bright scientist. So is everybody else.
Yeah.
I've never been the smartest guy in my community. I've never been the best writer in my community. And that's such a relief. Somebody once said, if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah. Last question is, how can people help out? What can people do to get involved?
Well, as a wise man once said, this is a fundraiser. We exist because every cent that's in my pocket, somebody donated, one way or another. Whether it was to the Jesuits, to the universities where I used to work, to the Vatican Observatory Foundation that allows us to continue the work we do. We can't live without your support. That support also means your prayers. And I'm going to come back to that because I don't want to underplay that. But some people will ask, there are a lot of great things to support. Universities. Universities need support. Grade schools need support. Schools for inner city kids. Please support those things. But if you're going to have a school, what are you going to teach them? What are the books that you're going to use? Who's going to write those books? I go back to what George Coyne once said, which it sounded very mysterious until I thought about it. If all we do is worry about what to eat and what to drink, we're all going to be starving. We need to recognize that we are human beings with souls that need feeding. We need to do the other things. But, the point of creation, the 7 days of creation are not complete without the seventh day, where God rests and looks at the universe and says, isn't this pretty good? We need your help and your community to remind people that this has been the work of the church, not just since 1891 when Pope Leo started the observatory, but from the medieval universities where astronomy was one of the 7 courses you had to take before you could do theology or philosophy. That the physical universe is so important that our scripture begins with the description of the Creator. The science in Genesis is 2,000 years old, a little out of date, but the theology has never gone out of date. That the universe, however you think it was made, was done by the one God who was outside the universe, who did it deliberately, did it as logically as day follows night, did it in the light so that we can see and follow along, because that's what we've been invited to do, and did it out of love. So being a part of this community to support the students at our summer school, to support the telescopes that allow us to do the kind of astronomy that other people don't get the grants to do. But as, Mickey has already given you the hard sell, and please, don't ignore that. The one thing, I was never trained to be a director. When I became the director, the first thing I did was pray the rosary. That's how desperate I was. And what prayer has done has to bring to me the people in this room, the people on our board, the employees that we have. I can tell stories about some of these people that out of the blue I got an email 10 years ago from some community college teacher who had some goofy question about Galileo, and I'm thinking, why am I wasting my time? Chris Graney has now co-authored several books with me, along with 2 books from Notre Dame Press on the history of astronomy, the world's leading expert in Riccioli, and my gosh, what a blessing he has been to us and to the observatory. Not only that, but he gives me all sorts of cool stories to tell from the history of astronomy. That was a gift of God. That was the answer to a prayer. I was talking to a science fiction fan buddy of mine. He said, I really am looking for somebody who can write a website. And he goes, I do that for a living. I was giving a talk at a little college in Erie, Pennsylvania, when a guy sits next to me and he says, I'm interested in this stuff. I said, would you like to make a little donation? And now he's the chairman of our board. These people are, to me, the sign that God has blessed this work. And it's because of your prayers that we're able to do it. Thank you, all of you, for coming.
That was wonderful.